Hi everybody, I am back to show you another floral watercolor design, and this lavender painting is great for beginners. It uses many of the same techniques that I used in my previous poppies and birch tree videos, if you'd like to check those out. And before I start today, I want to also quickly thank everybody for your support, for subscribing to the channel, liking videos, and I even received some of the sweetest and most encouraging comments that just made my day. I, teach for a living, and I'm used to being shy and kind of nervous in front of people if I have to do lectures or, teach a class. But something about being on social media is even more intimidating sometimes because the whole world can see you. So your support is really appreciated, especially as I grow my little channel. So I'm going to quickly put my supplies together and I will be right back. So the next thing we will do is prep our watercolor materials before we start painting. And I like to use hot press watercolor paper that I cut down into 5x7 inch sheets. And I like to work on two paintings at the same time because I can be impatient, if I'm being honest with you. I hate watching paint dry, and sometimes the weather also affects your paper drying time, especially as we move into autumn. Some of these things can be sped up with like a hair dryer if you're using it on a low heat setting. But for me, it's just easier to bounce back and forth between two paintings so I don't overwork my designs. And it's also great for beginners because you may have limited supplies on hand, and I don't want you to work through all of your materials when you need that wiggle room for learning. Another thing is that the white of our paper is very important with watercolor. The white is going to be your lightest value. And even though there is white watercolor available, like titanium white, it's never a true white like you're seeing right here. It'll also have this kind of gray tone. It's great for creating pastel colors, but it will not be opaque enough to cover over any material or any painting that you want to brighten. So I like to use white gouache as a backup, which I'm going to show you how to use today. And I actually use that on part of my stems here towards the bottom of my painting. It got a little bit dark and I just needed a little pop of color for that. So with gouache, it is more opaque. It has a chalkier consistency because it's using different materials. But it is wonderful, especially if you're a beginner, just learning how to use those light values in your designs. So next, I just want to go over our brushes that we're using today. I like to have a variety of round brushes in my studio when I'm working on watercolor. And an important thing I want to show you is that although we have this really tiny, skinny brush here, you'll notice that the point is better on our larger brushes. So when we're trying to get some of these really skinny lines and details, sometimes it's better to work with something larger like a number 12 round to create those nice points. I also like to use these long, skinny brushes to create the stems of my paintings. This is called a rigger brush, but you don't necessarily have to have this on hand. I'll show you some ways to use your other brushes that work just fine. And then you'll also want a large flat or filbert brush when we're trying to just wet our paper and create our background today. Next, we are going to start pre-mixing our colors before we paint, and this is tremendously helpful if you are a beginner or if you just want to learn a little bit of color theory. So with our colors, we're using a variation of our primaries, which is red, yellow, and blue. And if you don't have these exact colors that I have today, just try and find something similar to it in your supplies. So I have white gouache as an optional paint here if you want to test what it looks like to create these little highlights in your design. I have cadmium yellow. Lemon yellow also works beautifully if you want even more vibrant colors. Alizarin crimson and ultramarine blue. I also have some sap green here that's optional. It's a really good thing to have on hand to test with on paintings like this where you're mixing many different colors in your design with all these washes, and sometimes they get a little bit murky or brown, and a little bit of that is great because we're doing this natural painting. However, if you feel like you've lost some of that glow of your colors, you can do a little glaze of sap green after they've dried. So I'll show you how to use that today as well. And I'm using tube watercolors. So these come out quite thick as a consistency, so I'll have to dilute them with a little bit of water. Or you may have a set like this where you're using different pans or cakes, and these will also need to be activated with water. So sometimes you can just spray your entire palette with a spray bottle, or what I like to do is just use a little bit of water on my brush to drop into the color I'm using. Wait a few seconds and then it'll be ready to go. So I need to dip my brush in my water to activate my paints. And you want to keep your brush pretty damp the entire time you're working. If you feel like it's drying out a little bit, it's going to create textures. Now, if you like those textures, that's great. But if you don't, that will be an issue. So I'm going to start by mixing some of my violet colors here. So I'm going to take a little scoop of my alizarin crimson. Just put it right here. And I'll take a little bit of the excess of that and put it here. So I'm trying to create at least two violet colors. So one is going to be a little bit more blue in the blue range, and one is going to be more in the violet range. And then I can always dilute some of my alizarin crimson to create this really pretty like magenta color. So I'm going to then clean off my brush really quick and dip into some of my ultramarine. And then I can just start creating this color. Oops, sorry, somebody's blowing me up on my phone. And what I like to do is also have a little scrap piece of paper next to me where I can see what this color looks like. So I tend to just brush off some of that excess paint color on the side of my paint well, and that way I can see what that consistency is. And that's actually really pretty. So it's a nice, like almost like a periwinkle or lavender color. So that will work really well. And I will then add a little bit more blue to this other color. This one I want to be more in that magenta or like red-violet range. So this I can always dilute down if I put a little bit more water on my paintbrush. You can see how it can create a variety of this color or versions of this color with just a little bit of transparency. So that will be perfect for some of these other red-violet areas. So I'll leave those two as they are. I also want to mix a color for my upper part of my sky right here. So I'm going to take just a little bit of this original color. I'm going to just scoop a tiny bit of that in the center of my well here. And I'm going to add just a tiny bit more blue to it. A little bit more water on my brush. A little bit more blue. And that's pretty close. Actually, that's kind of perfect. So I want that to be quite transparent because this is just a little stripe of that color towards the top, and then I leave some water right here, and then I'll start adding in my yellow afterwards. So I'll leave that right there. Clean off my brush again, and then this is where I can start mixing these blue, green, and light green areas of the bottom part of my painting. So here I'm going to take a little scoop of my yellow. My paint dried out a little bit, but that's okay. It just gets reactivated with some water. This I'm going to mix just a little bit more of because I know that I will need to use that for both of my paintings if I decide to do two today, but I'll probably just do one. So I have that scooped into two wells. Again, you can press off some more of that color that might be hidden inside your brush just on the side of the well. I'm going to clean that off. And then I'm going to do the same thing that I did. I'm just going to use a little bit of blue in one of these. Creates a really pretty green. It's almost the color of my sap green if I were to do a swatch of that. And I don't want to have the exact same color. So I'm going to make this a little bit darker by adding just a little bit more blue to it. And that works. So you can see that these two are almost identical in their color range. So by adding just a little bit more blue, I can get a different green. And then on this one, I want it more in the blue-green range. So I'm going to add quite a bit more blue to this. And that's another shade of green. That's really pretty. If I want to do one more, which I think will be helpful right now, I can scoop up whatever green that was stuck in there. And I want to have this really deep blue green like you're seeing right here in my piece. So this is going to be mostly blue with just a little bit of yellow. And there you can see that color. So these are endless, there's endless ways that you can create your color range very quickly. And you can, again, always dilute these colors with a little bit of water. And that's where you get that wonderful range of color. And it helps you also learn about ways of mixing, because I know with watercolor, when you see them in the palette like this, you're not quite sure how much water to paint ratio there is. So that's why I always do swatches. It just helps me understand what I'm looking at. So now I'm pretty much ready to go. I'm going to scoop out a little bit of that greenish color out of my yellow that I have right here. I can just soak that up with a clean brush and wipe that off on my paper towel, just so I can keep some of that original yellow in there. And we are ready to go. Next, what we're going to do is use our larger brush, and then we are going to dampen the entire surface of our paper. And if you need to, go ahead and pause the video and get some clean water. Otherwise, any sort of pigments in your water from mixing your colors will transfer to your beautiful clean paper. And just to show you in advance what we're doing, this is the wet on wet technique, where we're going to take that periwinkle color that we mix for our sky, and while our paper is wet, we're going to just draw a line of this color across the very top of our paper. And when it hits that water on the paper, it's going to diffuse this line beautifully. After that, we're going to leave a little bit of space right here, just so we don't completely block out the whites of our paper and those lighter values. Then we're going to use our other brush and dot on some of our yellows and violets and red violets here. And that's going to create our sprigs in the background. So if you need to, again, go ahead and pause and we will start. So I'm just going to move this out of the way for just a second. And again, I'm taking some clean water and my large brush, swirling that around. And then I'm just going to start from the top. Oops, I look like I have a little bit of green on my brush, but I'm just going to go with it because I'm already wetting the paper. And you're just going to add in some very light pressure to your paper. And if it's a warm day, what you'll need to do is probably add a little bit more water to your paper, or else it will dry too quickly for this step. But today it's a little bit cooler in my studio, so I'm trying not to overload my paper too much. So I usually go in both directions. And I also have my paper at a slight angle just to let gravity do its job. And the nice thing is that, this will create a glossy color to your paper. So if you need to, you can move it around in your light just to make sure that you're not missing any spots. Because with watercolor, it's only going to move where the paper is. Okay, So if you need to, you can scoop up any excess color. You can see down here I put a little bit too much on. So I'm just going to take my brush and pull some of that up and just wipe it off on my paper towel. You don't want any big puddles of color because basically what happens is your paper expands while it is absorbing the water, and then it's going to contract while it starts to dry. So sometimes you get these little valleys and things in your paper that makes it difficult to manage. So as long as it's not too oversaturated, you should be fine. So after that, I'm going to use that same brush and run that strip of that periwinkle color across the top. I'm going to make this a little bit darker because I know on camera it's not showing up very well. And you can always make it a little bit darker if you want to have a more dramatic effect. You can see that okay. You can tilt your paper if you need to, if you want to make that blend down a little bit more. And you can see there's some of these, it almost looks like it's bleeding into the paper. Right here, that is called a bloom. So we're going to definitely add that to parts of our design today. Okay. After that, I'm just going to quickly clean off my brush. And I like to switch to my large round brush for this part because it has a nice point to it. So you can always tap on your color as you need to, or you can use a little bit more pressure to use what's known as like the belly of the brush right here. And that usually holds a lot of water and paint. So it depends on like your style and how dramatic you want your background to be. I'm just trying to keep it close to the original if you're interested in recreating that. So I'm going to just dilute a little bit of my yellow. This isn't mixed with anything else. And I'm going to tap that into a few spots. And again, the amount of yellow that you add is going to change how much of this color is going to show up. So for me, I can see my paper is already drying a little bit. So I'm going to wet my brush again, tap that onto a few spots, and that will help move that around a little bit. You can also use the side of your brush if you want to just blend that out in some spots. And yellow and violet are complementary colors. So when they're placed side by side, they make the other color just stand out. But we have to be careful on this next step to not have too much of it blend together because they will eventually neutralize each other if they are similar in ratio. So that's where you get your browns and gray colors and all these wonderful colors in between. But for right now, we want to keep this nice and vibrant. Add a little bit more yellow, just in a few spots, just to show some variation of color. We don't have very much yellow in this, but we have plenty of green that has yellow incorporated. But just a little bit of that goes a long way. After that, I'm going to clean my brush, and you can choose what color you want to dip in next. You can use your red violet or blue violet that we mixed for our lavender sprigs. And lavender is interesting because it is easier to kind of start with 3 little drops of color, and then you can leave a space, add 3 more little drops of color, and then a little bit on the end. And here you can see how adding too much of the violet and yellow together neutralizes it. This is a background color, so I'm not too worried about it. But as we get closer to the foreground, you just want to be aware of where that placement is. So just to show you again, I'm going to do 1 dot and then 2 around it. Leave a space. You can do 3 more little dots. And that way we have that separation of color that is typical for the shape of the lavender flower. Do a few more right here. And I'm just going to start working a little bit faster just because my paper is drying. So you can bounce back and forth between both lavender colors. And you don't have to think too hard about it. This is just going to blur in the background, so any little bit of it is going to shine through, but it's not going to be overwhelming for the rest of the piece. So feel free to add as many or few lavender buds that you'd like. Now this is very violet, so what I also want to do is just go directly into my alizarin crimson, and I'm going to add quite a bit of water to it to make it a soft pink color. And this is where you can tap that in to these already dampened areas of your paper if you just want to create a little variation of color. And you can create little sprigs in the background of that as well. You can see it's blurring out a lot of the shape that we originally put down, and that's going to look gorgeous whenever we add in our other lavender on top. So I'm going to add some towards the bottom too, just because I don't want this to look so heavy in the middle. And you can use the side of your brush again. You can see here I'm having like a little valley of water that's starting to build up just from gravity. So I'm going to let that sit for a few seconds, and I'm just going to use whatever water is left there and just move that around as needed. And then once you're happy with that, you can start adding in your green values. So I'm just going to do a little bit more of this, and a nice soft glow in a few spots. You can see even this area where it was a little bit more brown, that's even diffused because that color is moving around on the paper. So it doesn't look like anything is really messing with my design. Now I do want to add maybe a little bit more drama in a few spots towards the bottom half just to break up some of this lighter area, because typically in the bottom half of a design like this, it needs to be a little darker to show the shadows of all the sprigs of grass and stems. And also it just makes it feel more balanced, where you have this very light, let me show right here, the lightness of the flowers on the top half of my painting, and then on the bottom you can see where it's all connecting with the stems and with those shadows. So I'm just going to add a few more little dramatic moments of this violet just because I love this color. And you can see as my paper dries, it's going to move around a little less. So I'm going to go in now with my greens. You can use any green to start with. I'm just going to start with some of this blue green. I'm going to create just a few little lines with it. They will diffuse just like what we had happen with our other colors, but you can see how it's not moving around quite as much, which makes it fun to start to slow down a little bit with our painting and intentionally put in some of these smaller lines. I'll even add just the tip of my brush in a few spots to add some of that green towards the top and between those shapes. You can use just some little V shapes if you want to create some sprigs of that color. And then I also want to go in with my lighter green too, because this is a very blue green. I'm just going to break up a little bit of that color. So you're kind of just adding as you go with your washes. And this is just a great moment to experiment and let things kind of move around as they want without feeling like you're overwhelmed with details. We don't need lots of details for watercolor. That's what makes it so beautiful. And our brains are already telling us that this is a landscape and flowers just because of the shapes and the colors. So don't feel like it has to be photorealistic or anything. That's not what this painting is about. I'm going to add in some of that lighter green, and you can even go in with just some straight yellow if you want to make it even more dramatic and vibrant. And I'm trying to avoid this top area here just because I know that I'm going to be adding in some of those colors in just a little bit for my lavender that's in the foreground. But you can add just a few little dots of color towards the top just to connect the top from the bottom. But again, it doesn't have to be anything really pronounced. Clean off my brush really quick. And this is where you can have some fun with some of these puddles of paint that are forming towards the bottom. You can see right here that the gravity is really just pushing everything down. So if you feel like that is getting a little too much, and you can always tell because it just turns into like this big puddle, like a big blob, you can take the corner of your paper towel, and if you just set it right near the color, it's going to soak it up like a sponge. Right here, I'll show you too. You can just set it right beside it so you're not interrupting your painting, but you can see how it's already pulled up a lot of that color. You can also use your small brushes. This is where I like to use this rigger brush where it has these really long bristles. And with a little bit of water on it, we can start doing some backruns. Now, this only works if your paper is mostly saturated, where you can't have your paper saturate or absorb any more of the water. So I'm almost to that point in a few spots. I can see right here, it's starting to look like that, where it almost has like a velvety texture to it. So if I use just the tip of the brush and go over a few of the spots, it's going to start repelling that water because it can't absorb anymore. So it does a little negative shape for us. You can see right here how that's forming. So I love doing this just to create some nice little spindly lines. And you can create as many of these as you'd like. Sometimes it takes a second or two for this to show up, but it's just a really fun way to add in a little bit of texture and line work without thinking too hard. Again, I'm just using a little bit of pressure in the tip of my brush. And it helps to go in different directions. A lot of times when you're beginning to make art, or if you are thinking too hard, you're going to space everything out perfectly. You're going to have lines going in the same direction. And in nature, we want it to look a little bit more organic because it really does feel like organized chaos when you look at fields full of flowers and trees and anything in nature. And it just makes it a little more comfortable for yourself because it's taking some of that pressure off to be perfect. So you can create some little hook shapes if you want to. And I'll probably leave it right about there to dry. You also have the option, if your paper is still really wet, you can add a few granules of table salt if you want to create even more texture for your foreground and the bottom part of your painting. But for today, I'm just keeping it close to my original design. So I'm going to let this completely dry and I will be right back. All right, so we are ready for my favorite step in our painting, and that is putting in the details and the final values for our design. Now, if you're a beginner, our values mean just what our colors are from light to dark. So imagine on a grayscale going from black to white and think about all those gray tones in between. So we're doing this with color, which can be a little bit trickier, especially when we see the color of our tape right here that's very similar to the colors within our design. And even the texture of the tape right here can be distracting. So sometimes people will buy white tape that they'll just put directly over this at this point to just not have that color compete. But what I like to do is just take a scrap of my watercolor paper, or you can use any white paper, and you can lay it over your design at this point, and you can start to see the glow from our background showing through here. And it's going to look absolutely gorgeous when we add in our details. And even towards the bottom half of your painting right here, when you take away that tape color, you can see all of these lighter values and darker values that are forming. So if you need to, you can always just lay a scrap beside you when you're working on this bottom half. And you'll also notice these negative shapes that are forming for when we did backruns. And I want to keep some of those in on this step because I find them really beautiful. So we're going to paint in between some of these shapes to make that stand out even more. So just for comparison's sake, I know some of this stuff doesn't really make sense. It's hard to explain art, but you can see how I've added some darker values of this dark green right in between some of my lighter values. And I'll show you how to pull up that color or lift that color if you need to. And then eventually I'm going to show you how to add highlights, especially in our lavender sprigs here and in some of our stems. So this is where we're going to just slow down a little bit more with our painting and really look at the shapes that are forming throughout here. For example, I really love this spot right here, so I may not touch that at all with paint. That can just stay as it is. But some of these other areas where they look like they're not so defined, that's where I can choose where to add that paint. So the first thing we're going to do is just choose what parts of our lavender we want to have in our foregrounds and in our backgrounds, because I like to try and have at least some separation between the two, just so it doesn't make it look like everything is just sitting on the surface of our painting. So I just chose a few of them to define a little bit more, and then some of the other ones just blur more into the background and middle ground of our painting. Even here where like this really bloomed in different areas, that itself can just stay that way. So if you have some of these, I suggest, choosing which ones you really want to emphasize. So on here, I have a few down here that I'm probably going to keep similarly to my original, where I won't touch them at all. But then one like this, where I have this little shape right here that I'm not totally in love with, I'll probably cover that a little bit with some paint. And then I love where these two cross right here. However, I need to be careful that I'm not creating a big X right in the middle of my painting, because that just looks more like a target. So this is just where you can just take a few moments to think about what you want to define and go from there. So I'm going to use the same brush, or if you are having larger or smaller lavender, you can choose your other small round where it has a nice point to it. So this is my number 6 and 12. And we're going to do the same thing that we did before, but as you can see here, we're just defining a few areas of our lavender. So some of those blooms and other marks that are happening behind it can stay as they are. You don't have to do the entire shape that you just painted in. And then again, we're going to leave some of these as they are as well. So I'm going to use my brush and dip it in my water. And you just want to make sure that whatever color you place on here is going to be darker than what you already have on your background. So if you need to, you can mix a little bit more of your blue and alizarin crimson together, which I'm going to do right now. And sometimes what happens when you are mixing on a smaller brush, or even on your larger one, is it's hard to tell how much water is in your paintbrush. So before you do some of this detail work, I suggest just tapping your brush on your paper towel. You can see how some of that water just came out. That water would have ended up somewhere on your painting that would have turned into like a blob. So to get in the habit of that, you're just going to tap your brush on your paper towel before you start adding in these lines. So here I'm going to follow this shape, and I'm just going to do what I did before, where I'm making 3 little shapes. I'm leaving a space, adding a few more little shapes, and then going from there. So I'm leaving some of that original color behind it, but we're just defining some of that. I'll do some right here too. Again, it doesn't need to be perfect. We're just tapping on in this scumbling fashion. And I don't want to have this look all the same color, so I'm going to dip into some of my alizarin crimson, and I'm just going to tap that in a few spots just to give it a little bit more color. Work in a few more ways right here. And sometimes I'll just let whatever's left over on my brush just move around, so then I have different values coming from there. Like this one barely has any paint on it. So I can always load my brush up again if I need to. Okay. Now some of these colors look a little bit dark too. You can clean off your brush, and you can do like what you did with your paper towel, where you can just soak up some of that color, or you can lift some of that color to create a slightly different shape. And you can see how that little change in value right there makes it look a little bit better. And this is good if you're a beginner where you're not quite sure how to do some of these more advanced techniques, and you're just kind of learning how to create the shapes and get used to like holding the brush, because that does take time to feel comfortable with. I'm going to just add a little bit more drama to some of these now. I'm going to go back into some of that alizarin and our blue mixed together, and you can drop some of that color back into any of these spots. And this dries very quickly. So what we're doing is dropping in some of this color to create like a variegated wash within our little shapes. And since that part of your design is damp, what it'll do is it'll move those watercolors around, but it won't disturb your background because there's no water around it. I hope that makes sense. Now what I'll do at the same time as these are drying is I'm going to take a more spindly brush. So this is my rigger brush again. If you don't have that one, just use one of your brushes with a nice point on it. And I'm going to dip into one of my greens that we mixed for our background. Again, try to have it a little bit darker from what you're painting in already. And just like before, I'm mixing that color, but I'm also, after I load it up on my brush, I'm going to tap off any of that excess water. This one doesn't have so much, but it's good to just test. And then I'm going to hold my brush at a completely vertical angle where I'm just using the very tip of the brush to do this part. So I'm going to paint in between our little lavender shape, and then I'm just going to drag that color down. Do the same right here. And anywhere where that paint is wet, it's going to move some of that color into your little lavender sprigs to make even more beautiful colors within your blooms. So keep loading up your brush as you need it. And that's where it makes it have this effortless look to it as well. Even though, as we already tell, like watercolor is not that easy. It takes a lot of patience and like a delicate hand at times. So just keep loading up your brush, and we're just going to add more of that color. We're separating our sprigs from the rest of our painting and just bringing them forward with these darker lines. And that's a really good start to that. So I'll also just do a few little lines of color. And you can switch your greens too on this part. It doesn't all have to be the same green color. I like to mix it up a little bit. You can have some going in different directions. This is where you can have some broken lines too, which looks even more natural. You can create some of these little spindly, if you wiggle your hand a little bit. Usually with lavender, they have two little leaves that are coming off of that, and then usually just a little bit around this part. And this looks a little too spaced out perfectly, so I'm going to have to change that up a little bit. Again, it's so funny what our brains do to us when we don't want them to do that. It's just a habit. Same as before, since these are wet colors, let's say you want to add a little bit of yellow in there or something, or a lighter green, you can do that, and that will add a little bit more definition to those shapes. I'm going to switch my brush up in a second too, because this one, I feel like I'm getting too tight with it. And I want to show you how to loosen up a little bit more with your design. So I'm going to switch to my medium rounds. This is my number 6. And I'm going to go in with just some of my yellow with a tiny bit of blue added. It almost gives it like a mustard color. And I'm going to just paint in a few little shapes. Oops, my poor little handle of this came off. I have to use these because my dexterity right now still sucks from my injury, so it's a little tricky to hold a brush at the moment. But you can see doing some of these larger lines where I'm using more of the belly of the brush helps to just break up some of these shapes and make it less stiff. We don't want it to look too overworked, and we definitely don't want to make it too busy at times either with the same little spindly lines. We want to have some variation of that color and spots. So again, we're just adding a little bit more towards the bottom. You can see that yellow really helps to make some of these other colors pop. And I definitely think I need something right here. So I'm going to add another sprig of lavender. Just mixing a slightly different color. So this one I think I want a little bit more on that red violet side. Again, tapping that on. I'm using this other brush and you can see how it changes, how that looks. It's a little bit more precise. You get more of these points to it. So if you need to, you can always switch your brush around and that will create different little shapes to it as well. I'll use some of this in a few spots on my other one too. I feel like they're all too similar. Add some of this color down towards the bottom. And this is where if you add some of that, you can always blur it out with a little bit of water on your brush. Starts to connect some of these flowers on the top to the rest of your painting so they don't look like they're just sticking out doing nothing. Again, we're just putting some color down and then we're just going to add some water to our brush to blur out some of those colors. And that really made a difference. I feel like that looks way better already. Just needs a little bit more. And this is where some browns and other colors might mix together on your piece. And that's fine too, because that's also found in nature. So it's doing a lot of the work for you by just mixing on the paper already. Really love that alizarin crimson mixed with a little bit of blue. So I'm just going to keep emphasizing that in a few spots. And again, I'm just putting a little bit more water on my brush as needed. If I need to, I can completely blur that out and tap off any of that excess color if I don't like where that's going. So there's a little bit of erasing you can do with watercolor. Go back in with some of that darker lavender color in a few spots towards the bottom. And again, I'm going in between some of these shapes. So I'm just breaking them up a little bit. And then if I don't like something, I can use my brush with a little bit of water on it and lift some of that color. You can also use that to lift any lighter areas that you want to keep in your painting. See, I like how that looks right there. And you're just going back and forth trying to figure out where you want these values to be. I may want more of this darker blue in a few spots just because it's starting to look a little bit top heavy. Using just the tip of my brush in a few spots. So where you can add some more little leaves and other parts of our lavender that may need just a tiny bit of structure to them. Keep it nice and loose. There's really no wrong way you can do this. Because again, if there's something you don't like, you can just always pull it up while that color is still wet, and then you have what you need. And I'm trying not to make this look exactly like my other one just because I like to play with color too. So this one I might have it be a little bit more on that alizarin crimson side. If you don't like that, just add a little bit more blue to yours and that will help. I just figured I can have a little fun on camera and you can see the process if you're just learning. And again, make sure that you're doing work that your brain is kind of pulling you towards. I don't want yours to look exactly like mine. I want you to explore your different options, and then you can start to learn what you like about art and watercolor, learn what kind of colors you're drawn to and textures that you're drawn to, and it just makes it really exciting. I know I'm keeping this quite like loose and more natural, but maybe you want something a little bit more abstract or geometric. Like there's so many different patterns you can go on with this that will make it a beautiful design. So here this looks a little too stiff. So I'm going to clean my brush and just have a little bit of water on it, and I'm just going to diffuse a little bit of those lines. Have some of them look like they're kind of blending into the background. And I'm just using a little bit of pressure and scumbling with my brush, because I felt like they were just too perfect. I don't want that. You can tap off any sort of hard lines that might be forming, or you can just blur them out with a little bit of water. Like that. I already like that more. If I go in with a slightly darker blue in some spots, that's really going to help that. Let me show you. Maybe make this one a little bit bigger too. Maybe too big. Let me pull some of that back. There we go. Same here, maybe I just want to diffuse some of this a little bit. Just adds a little bit more movement in your design. Or if you like how that looks, just leave it as it is. Sometimes I get these little hard lines that form too, and I'll leave some of these in my painting, but if I feel like some of it's a little distracting, I'll just pull that up with my paper towel and some water. So I'm at a good point now where I'm starting to get some lighter and darker values, but I still feel like I need something else towards the bottom to break up some of these shapes. So I think what I'm going to do, I feel like maybe this alizarin crimson is overpowering a little bit more of my violet color, so maybe I'll add a little bit more violet towards the bottom. Using that same small brush, just going to mix a little bit more blue with a tiny bit of alizarin crimson. And again, this is where I'm just slowing down and seeing what I want to do with my painting. So I'm just going to go in between a few spots. So I need a little bit more blue. Oh yeah, I like that. Definitely needed some of that. And I really like how that's looking. So I think next I will just go in with my darkest green, like that blue-green color, and just emphasize just a few more little lines towards the bottom, just to make sure that my stems stand out a little bit more. And then we'll do our highlights. You can wiggle your hand a little bit if you want to add some other little shapes in there. And you can see that's helping to create some of those darkest values. And if they feel a little too heavy, just clean off your brush and you can lift using a clean wet brush and your paper towel. Or you can make them a little bit smaller lines if you feel like they're all too the same. I like where this one's blurring right here, so I'm going to leave that one alone. But right here, that line feels a little heavy, so I can just scoop some of that up with my brush and blur some of that towards the background, and that'll look really nice. I'm just going to pull that color all the way down. Yeah, that'll be perfect. If it gets a little too much, you can always blot up some or just diffuse some of that with a little bit of water until you feel like you've hit a good stopping point. I want maybe just a little bit more yellow in this in one or two spots. Now, if yours looks really murky, like you're seeing through some here, we can go back in with some of our sap green. That was the one that we didn't mix with anything else. You can load up your brush with that, and you can create some really nice pops of a bright, vibrant green color in a few areas. See how that just made that stand out a little bit more? And it's a nice transparent color, so it just adds a little bit more to your values. Sometimes you need that really vibrant green. Oh yeah, I love that right there. That's beautiful. I'm even going to have some of this come up here into these stems, just in a few little spots. You can always add them to a little bit of your colors because your lavender does have a little bit of green that connects the stem to the rest of the sprigs. And it just adds a little bit more of that pop of color that you might be wanting in your design. And that looks really good. I love that. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to let that sit and dry for a few minutes, and then I will show you how to create your highlights, and we will be done. All right, so we are on the last part of our painting process where we're just going to add in a few little highlights and details for our stems, and also just to separate a little bit of the values in our lavender. So just to show you from the original, you can see how I've added a pop of white just throughout here with my gouache. So gouache, as I said earlier, is similar to watercolor, but it has a more opaque color. It's also more chalky in consistency because it uses different ingredients. So it's going to react a little bit differently. It has a matte finish to it. And if you don't want to use gouache like that, if you redo this painting, what you can do is think ahead a little bit and you can use masking fluid. Now, masking fluid is basically like liquid latex that you could use. But as a beginner, if you're starting out, you don't really need to worry about that yet. But I will have more videos coming up on how to use masking fluid and prep paintings for these white layers to show through. So to do this, what I'm going to use is my long spindly brush again, or you can use your medium round brush that has a nice point to it. And with gouache, it comes out very similar in consistency to our watercolor. You're going to need to dilute it with just a little bit of water typically to activate it. Or you can work directly from the tube. And I'm just going to add a few little moments of color. Mine's been sitting out a little while, so I have to just activate it. And you can water it down if you want to create some lighter values and gray tones. And just like before, what we want to do is use just the tip of our brush. And I'm going to go just right beside some of our lines here if I need to thicken them up a little bit. And I'm just going to use some broken lines just to bring those forward. You can also tap some of that out on a few spots of your lavender. That one doesn't need it so much, but this one kind of does. Or if you like how it looks, you can just leave it as it is. So some of this I'm going to blur out a little bit with some water. But we're just creating another value. Do a little bit more of our stems. Just to make them stand out from the rest of our design. And again, I'm using broken lines just so they don't look too much like an outline in areas. And that really just makes a difference with showing off some of your highlights. It's kind of like at the end of a tattoo session where that is like kind of the worst part because your skin's all inflamed and painful, but then when they add those little pops of white, it just looks gorgeous. That's if you get tattoos. I don't know if you get tattoos. You can even do some of this with your stems if you want some of your leaves to stand out. Maybe I want to just be a little bit different today. I'm going to add some little lighter highlights and spots. This one looks a little odd. I think I need to change just a little bit of the shape of it. But you can just watch the process, and then obviously your painting is going to look different, so you'll decide what works best for the design. I may even go in with some darker values in just a few spots to make them stand out even more. But I like this little pop of color. Here you can see where it's more opaque than watercolor, but it's still not as white as your paper. It can get pretty close, especially if you're working directly from the tube, where it's like its thickest consistency, but there's always a little bit of transparency to it. And there's other things out there that you can use. Some people just use some watered down acrylic paint as well, but I like that gouache can be reactivated as necessary, just like watercolor. I'll create some different little shapes in here. I don't want to overwork it, but I'm probably going a little too crazy with it right now. I just want you to see your options. Okay, so if some of this looks a little strange, I'm going to switch to my small round brush here. Like some of these lines, you can just activate that gouache with a little bit of water, and that's going to push that back into your design. And then what I'll also do is I think I need a little bit more of a darker blue for some of this, especially on this one where it's all a similar value with this red violet. So I'm just going to mix that really quick and show you. So I'm going to mix just a little bit more blue violet. So I'm using my ultramarine blue with a little bit of alizarin crimson. But with this, because I'm working with tube paints, I want this to be a little bit thicker of a paint, just like my gouache coming on there, just to overpower, or not overpower, but stand out against the colors that are already on there. So if you need to, you can do a swatch of that as well. And it's a nice, it's almost just ultramarine straight out of the tube, but it has a little bit of alizarin crimson. And that's where you get some of these deeper colors here that we're seeing in our design. So I'm going to add just a little bit more alizarin crimson to it just to make it match the values that are already in my painting. A little bit more blue. And that is perfect right there. So it's a little bit deeper than what's already on my painting right here. And I'm just going to tap that color in a few spots using that same scumbling technique. And this I'm going to use sparingly trying to get that overall shape back because this one got a little blurred out. That looks a little bit better. And I might do that just in a few spots on these. Especially if you feel like your stem is overpowering some of your colors or it's like sitting on top of it. And then you can always go back in with a little bit of gouache if you need to blur that out. So I'm just cleaning off my brush, dipping into some of my gouache, and then I can just tap that with it, and that will create another little value right there. So it's an easy way to learn about value in colors without having to mix a bunch of new ones into your design. It still looks a little funny to me. I think I just keep messing with this one. It's always like one part of my painting where I'm like, why are you doing this? But it's me just overworking that area a little bit. And I'm also seeing it at an angle. So I may like it in about 10 minutes. It's hard to tell. But there's usually one part of my painting where I'm like, oh, you're my little problem child. And, you know, that's normal too. And then you basically can hit whatever stopping point that you like with it. I may just add a little bit of this color down towards the bottom in a few areas. You can see it's my blue mixed with a little bit of my gouache. So this is where, again, I can break up some shapes as needed with that color. And it also connects the colors up here that I just introduced to somewhere else in my painting, which I think is very important just to create some harmony within your designs. Like this line right here looks a little overpowering, so I may just blur that out a little bit. And that's looking good. Yeah, I like how that looks. This one I still don't love, but I'm going to find a way to fix it just to show you on camera. Go back in with some of my other greens. Maybe that's what's messing me up with this. It needs a little bit more structure to it to make that stand out. But again, you just slow down a little bit. This is where you decide where you want these things to go. And there is such a thing as like overworking it. So I'm on the brink of doing that with this design, but I also, you know, prefer to try and work through it before I give up. Because it's very easy to just say like, this sucks, I'm going to throw this away or start over. But you learn the most when you keep trying to push through those moments. And sometimes you don't win, right? Sometimes it just like ends up being a not very good painting or drawing, but it's the process that really teaches you the most. So yeah. Last little bits that I'll show you is I'm just going to lift some of these colors up. This is where I can do more of these, almost similar to backruns, but we're lifting intentionally some of these values that may be a little bit too distracting. So if it gets too busy in areas, just use a clean, wet brush. And you can just create some lighter values that really help you see those shapes. And I will have a tutorial coming up on like negative painting and shapes, because that's one of the things that I feel like it's a little hard to get at first, but then as soon as you do, it just brings your artwork to like another level where you can see in between your shapes and decide where you want those lighter values to go. And I absolutely love using negative painting techniques because there is just something really challenging about working in reverse and like seeing your shapes from a different perspective. But it's really elevated the work that I do and just given me something to look forward to, because sometimes, you know, if you do the same kind of art over and over again, at least for me, I can get bored with it very quickly. So I need something to challenge me constantly, else I feel like I'm just not necessarily wasting my time, but I don't want to be bored making art. It's too much fun and it's too beautiful to feel that way about. So I can just distort or blur some of these colors out with a little bit of water as well. And I really like how that looks now, where I just needed some of these lighter values showing through. So I hope this helps you if you're beginning or if you're advanced and you're just looking for something new to do. And if you'd like to share, I would love to see how your designs turned out. So enjoy your day, and I will see you again soon in another one of my videos, hopefully.